Got it. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to be with you here in Dearborn Heights. I understand. Can you hear me okay? I'm talking through the.
You better without it.
Without it? Okay. All right. All right. Everyone has spoken. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Wonderful. It's great to be with you in Dearborn Heights. I understand this is the first in-person meeting at this library. Oh, it is not. Okay. The second. Okay. One of the first. And then we've also got some folks joining from Zoom as well. So that's very exciting. I'm going to be alternately projecting to the folks in the room as well as to the folks back on Zoom. I'm here. My name is Andrew Lapin, and I'm here today to talk to you about a subject I've been researching for the last few years, which is Father Charles Coughlin and his connection to American fascism. Tonight's actually the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, which is a harvest holiday. It's meant to be very festive, and so it's really exciting for me to be here with you today, although to discuss a subject that is maybe not so festive. Before we get going, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Metro Detroit. Grew up in Huntington Woods. Currently I work as the managing editor for local news for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which is a newswire service similar to the Associated Press that covers the Jewish world. Previously, I was the editor-in-chief of the Detroit Jewish News, and I also do a lot of film criticism for sites such as NPR and Vulture, a lot of writing about the media, and I call myself a Father Coughlin obsessive as well, which I will explain more about what that means. But I actually have something very exciting to share with you, which is that this talk you're about to see is a preview for a podcast that I have coming out. It's a multi-part serialized podcast that is going to go into much more detail about Father Coughlin. That show is also called Radioactive, and it premieres 2 weeks from today. So hopefully, if you like this talk, you'll check out the podcast when it comes out. My journey to trying to understand. Sorry. Sure. Yeah. While Rob is doing that, I'll just mention, so the talk will probably go for about 40 minutes. And then afterwards, I'm happy to take questions that you have. And for those on the Zoom, you can send questions via chat, and we'll get those answered as well. How's that? Is that better? Wonderful. All right. So my journey into Father Coughlin begins here at the National Shrine of the Little Flower Catholic Church in Royal Oak, Michigan, which is just about a mile from where I grew up. And this is the church that Father Coughlin himself founded in 1926. It's nearly a century old. It is still an active congregation, and it sits on a very prominent corner of Woodward Avenue. This is a very tall tower that you see that's called the Charity Tower, and it stretches about 100 feet tall. And it has this big, limestone carving of Jesus on the cross, and it's very large. Anyone who is in this area, you drive past it, you can't possibly miss it. It is a major landmark of the Detroit area. And when I was younger, my dad, who also grew up in the area, when we would drive by it, he would say, "You know what we used to call this when we were kids?" And I said, "No, what?" And he said, "The Shrine of the Little Fascist." And I said, "Oh, that's wild." And he said, "Yeah, it's because the person who founded it, he had a radio show, and he used it to spread anti-Semitism all over the country, and then people sent him money. That's how it got so big." And I thought, wow, that is it was like one of the most astonishing things I'd ever heard, because no one ever talked about it really. And it just seemed like this kind of almost forgotten corner of history. But actually, over the last couple of years in particular, more and more things that have happened in the US have reminded me of this history and inspired me to dig into the story of Father Coughlin a bit more. So, we'll do a quick recap of the past year. So here in Michigan, as many of us are aware, there were several protests at the state capitol, many of them armed, centered around COVID-19 restrictions. There was also allegedly a plot by some local militias to kidnap the governor. And then on the national level, of course, we had the events of January 6th, the so-called Stop the Steal rally, otherwise known as the attempted insurrection, when thousands of people stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to overthrow a democratically elected president. In addition to that, over the last several years, there have been many alarming instances of anti-Semitism on American soil, the likes of which really have not been seen since the days of World War II. We had the neo-Nazi march on Charlottesville in 2017. We had the mass shooting that occurred at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, which was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. And we've also had many other really unfortunate and sad violent altercations that were clearly anti-Semitic in nature, attacking rabbis in New York and in California. A rabbi in Boston very recently was stabbed, and kosher supermarkets have been attacked as well. It has been a very unsettling and I would say a fearful time for many American Jews who did not think that these kinds of events would ever be coming back into the public eye. The word that I keep hearing from TV pundits and other experts during this time is that we are living in unprecedented times, that this has never happened before in American history. I'm sorry to say that I don't see it that way. I think there is quite a lot of precedents, historical precedents for the moment that we're in. So I take you back now to January of 1940. It was only about 80 years ago. There was another militia group, anti-government militia group in this country called the Christian Front. And the FBI arrested several members of them and put them on trial, charged them with intent to overthrow, put down, and destroy by force the government of the United States. So these were, Americans gathering in groups across the country, and they were armed, and they had target practice, and they had this plot to overthrow the government because they did not like the direction that the country was moving in at the time. The Christian Fronters were very closely aligned with another group at the time called the America First Committee, which called itself an isolationist group. It wanted to keep Americans out of war, out of World War II. It was led by notable figures such as Charles Lindbergh, another Detroit figure. But very frequently, what people saw at the time was that what started as an anti-war movement actually cloaked a lot of deeper anti-Semitic and fascist tendencies. And a lot of people who called themselves America Firsters were in fact Nazi sympathizers. Many of them gathered at this pretty infamous rally in 1939 at Madison Square Garden, where you had American Nazi sympathizers addressing crowds of thousands, flanked by the red, white, and blue Star Spangled Banner, as well as the swastika. Really trying to advocate that Nazism was the path forward for America. And you had people from the stage decrying quote Jewish communism in our schools and in our universities and our very homes, and people, the leaders who were giving this talk that were representing the fascist movement also shouted out one figure they held in particularly high regard, who was of course Father Coughlin, otherwise known as the radio priest, because he, as I said, had this radio show that he broadcasted from here in Detroit, reaching upwards of 30 to 40 million Americans every week. He came on Sunday afternoons from 1926 to 1940. The stories were that the people who listened to him, they would keep their windows open. And so if it was a hot day and you were walking outside, you would hear the voice of Father Coughlin coming from every house that you passed. And he was started out in a more benign sense, but eventually became the person I refer to as America's first mass media demagogue. Really the first person in American history who realized the power of a mass communication tool, in this case the radio, to spread fear and distrust, and to build a cult of personality around oneself. And that is really what Father Coughlin did. That was his biggest innovation. And he was doing this way ahead of his time. The medium of radio was almost completely unregulated. It was early days, and yet almost every American had one in their home. So he really had this tremendous access to people, unlike anything that we had seen before in this country. And he was unquestionably a demagogue. He was unquestionably anti-Semitic. Certainly by the end of his radio broadcasts, he was pretty outright saying that Jews were part of the secret plot to control the world. I'm going to try to play for you a little bit of him. I got my other laptop here, so if you can't hear it, I'm sorry, but I wanted to give you just a little taste of what he sounds like. Let's see.
The quotation which discloses for us that leap-in arrangement. A worldwide policy advocated not by religious views, but by international views, to coordinate a regiment of forces of Gentile Christian nations under the leadership of Jews, not only to cast Hitler into hell, but to substitute for the national anthems of the countries concerned the national anthem of Jewry.
All right, so hopefully you can hear a little bit of what Father Coughlin sounded like there. And as I said, this is really textbook anti-Semitism. There's no way around that. But to understand how we got to this point where one man from Detroit had the ability to spew out anti-Semitism to the entire country, we need to step back a little bit, consider where Father Coughlin came from and how he became so powerful. So he was actually an immigrant. Coughlin was born in Hamilton, Ontario in 1891, entered the priesthood very early, and was always a very ambitious man, and realized from a young age that he had a real gift for oratory, that he could really spin a lot of excitement from his voice. And he sensed that there was a growing opportunity in Detroit, which was a boomtown in the 1920s, thanks to local mogul Henry Ford, obviously very deep connection to Dearborn. Ford at the time was not only this brilliant engineer and car and automobile inventor, but also a very well-known anti-Semite. And he had a newspaper that he published called the Dearborn Independent, which ran headlines such as this one: "The International Jew, the World's Problem." And Ford was doing this in the mid 1920s. For all of his, for all of Ford's gifts, we'll say he was not exactly a very good media personality, and his attempt at starting an anti-Semitic media empire died pretty quickly. By the time Coughlin came over in 1926, it was no more. But nevertheless, Ford's presence on the scene really inspired Coughlin, and the two would later become compatriots. Coughlin was recruited to Detroit in 1926 by the local bishop, because there was a growing Catholic population in the city, people coming to work in Ford's factories. And so they were starting this new parish in Royal Oak. And Coughlin had, as we said, was a very ambitious man. And so he took out a large loan to build this giant church that was many times bigger than the Catholic population at the time. And it had all these ornate, sculptures, and it was a really sort of massive thing to behold. And he decided he was going to pay for it by getting on the radio, which he did through the help of some other friends that he met in the city, and using his radio platform to petition people for donations. So listeners from all around the country would send him money, just $1 or $2, but it was enough to really get him going. This is actually, I come from the public radio world. This was the first, membership program, radio membership program in the country, and so this was another innovation that Coughlin did. Is you just go on the air and you ask people for money, and some of them will give it to you if they like what you're selling. So this is what happened in the early days. Coughlin's show was very benign. It had no political content. It was mostly about it was Bible study for children, actually. And then things changed. In 1929, obviously the Great Depression happened. Millions of Americans are out of work. People are looking for answers, right? Because they don't seem to have much of a future, and they want someone to reassure them that things are not their fault. And this is when we start to see Coughlin become more interested in politics. and he really goes after, you know, the enemies at the time, which were the elites, the bankers, you know, who many believe had caused the Great Depression. And then you also had the communists, who Coughlin spent his entire life being vociferously anti-communist, and they were atheists, and they were going to leech all the Christianity from America's lifeblood. And so he had sort of found his targets, and he was going after them. He was going after presidential candidates. He was finding his voice. At the same time, he was advocating for unions. He was for the working man, and this really attracted people to him, particularly, you know, blue collar people. But outside of Catholicism, people who were not Catholic, people who were not Christian, some Jews at this point were listening to him and agreeing with him. And so this is where he hits his stride, you know. And this is a photo of kind of what the typical scene would be, just you know, regular middle class American couple sitting around the radio and listening to Coughlin. He endorses Franklin Roosevelt for president in 1932 because he has these grander ambitions of power. And then FDR kind of spurns him because he's a little afraid of Coughlin and the movement he's building. And so Coughlin immediately turns on FDR and becomes sort of the leading critic of the Roosevelt administration heading into the New Deal era. And this allows Coughlin to grow his following even more, even though he is wading, you know, further into these sort of hard right waters. This is when he's reaching his peak audience and when he is sort of at his peak influence. He becomes so influential that by 1936, Coughlin he wants to be a political player. He wants to have more say in what is happening. And so he launches, to cultivate his movement, first he launches a weekly news magazine, which he calls Social Justice. But what he means by social justice is not the way we use the term today, but he was referring to social justice for white people. And he also starts a political third party to go along with his new movement. And it's called the National Union for Social Justice. And he partners with some other fringe political figures at the time, and they want to fashion themselves as kind of the main challengers to FDR. He actually recruits a sitting U.S. Congressman, William Lemke from North Dakota, to run for president on this brand new party that had never existed before, which I think is pretty remarkable. That it really shows the influence he had over the country at this point. Of course, all this is happening as fascism and Nazism is on the rise in Europe. And there's this growing, you know, debate between isolationism and interventionism. None of this really seems to bother Coughlin all that much. So this allows Coughlin to sort of the freedom to do what he always wanted to do, which is just have these big rallies and cultivate mass audiences. So he's traveling the country. They even hold their own party convention in Cleveland, as you can see. Thousands of people are present, and Coughlin is much more unhinged at these rallies than he was on the radio. Where on the radio he had a much calmer voice, and he was very careful with the words he chose. He was careful not to outright dive into anti-Semitism too much, but here he openly indulges in it. And so we have video footage of him at these rallies where he's challenging every Jew in this country to tell him that they don't believe in the good Christian principles. And so you really see that he is baiting he is baiting hatred. He wants to have a scapegoat for why people are out of work and miserable, and the Jews are a handy one for him. The end result of this, as you may know, is that FDR won in a complete landslide. He had the largest electoral victory margin by a presidential candidate in a century. The country is very much sort of on his side and backing his policies. The Union Party that Coughlin put his entire reputation on the line to boost receives less than 2% of the popular vote. So a lot of the political pundits at the time, are saying, oh, "That's it. He's done. He's had his moment in the sun. He's embarrassed himself. He's going to go away." This is not what happened. Coughlin, having seen his mainstream bid for respectability failed, instead leans very hard into extremism and cultivating and radicalizing the followers he still has left. So even though he doesn't reach the same heights of listenership as he did before, the people who are listening to him are much more dangerous and are much more willing to go to extreme lengths to realize his vision of America. And so he starts dipping overtly into anti-Semitism on his radio show, becomes particularly enamored the conspiracy theory known as Jewish Bolshevism, which holds that Jews are the secret controllers and puppet masters of communistic thought in the world. This ties very nicely into the fact that Coughlin has already proclaimed himself very anti-communist. He's also writing basically fan mail to Benito Mussolini, and praising the Italian fascist dictator and inviting him to use his newspaper to better educate Americans about his beliefs. Coughlin is also publishing in his magazine this infamous anti-Semitic document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which again is purports to show the secret plans for Jewish world domination. It was a Russian forgery that dates back approximately to the 1800s that has been widely debunked and still seems to be floating around. And in fact, just a decade earlier, Henry Ford had done the same thing, published the protocols in the Dearborn Independent. And so in addition to all of this, Coughlin is still trying to form movements that will answer to him. And so he starts talking on his radio show about, with all this growing communism, we really need an alternate opposing force. Someone needs to start a Christian front, a group of full-blooded Christians who will stand up for what's right. And so, of course, what happens is that the people listen to him start groups called the Christian Front, which, as I said, gathered in these pockets, mostly in New York and Boston. Boston was a huge Coughlin boosting city at the time, and they started what were basically like pogroms. I mean, they went out in the street and found Jews to attack, and they, there were radical splinter groups, and they were trying to boycott Jewish-owned businesses, and they were trying to do a lot of things that were very unpleasant, and the FBI, which was newly formed at the time, was very anxious that this was like a budding terrorist group, and they seemed to be answering to Coughlin. In fact, that's kind of what the message was from a lot of other leaders at the time who wanted to rein in the Christian Front. They said, Coughlin, Father Coughlin, the Christian Front is your child. You have fostered it, encouraged it. You can't evade responsibility for this organization. Whereas Coughlin was, saying, well, I don't have any control over what they do. They answer to themselves, but I agree with what they're doing, but I'm not going to control them. And there was a lot of concerted effort from people. People were very scared in mainstream America about what the Christian Front might represent. So this sort of comes to a head by the late 30s, and we enter the most infamous radio episode of Father Coughlin's career. This is in November of 1938. This was shortly after the events known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass in Nazi Germany, which is where roving gangs of hoodlums and thugs, aided by Nazi guards, smashed windows of Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues and other Jewish locations around Germany. It was a shock to a lot of folks in the world, and it was sort of this final sign that Jews were no longer safe in Nazi-controlled territory, and so most of the world was horrified by this. Father Coughlin's approach, his take on Kristallnacht, is that maybe the Jews deserved it because they have so much power and they've risen to such high places, in the media and in the financial world, that this is just the last straw. This is just sort of the world righting itself. So a lot of people are horrified when he does this, and he loses a lot of his mainstream broadcasters who are really trying to drop him, and the Catholic Church is working behind the scenes as well, trying to shut him up. Whereas before, they were afraid of alienating him because they didn't want him to leave the church and take his followers with him. But after this, it becomes really hard to defend or even tacitly support the things that Father Coughlin is saying. And so the FBI, as I said, is pressuring him, and the Vatican is pressuring him. So he drops his radio show in 1940, but not before he uses it to defend the group of Christian fronters who were placed on trial for plotting to overthrow the government. He uses the show to say basically that I agree with them, and this is an unfair trial, and none of them, they all got off. They were all found not guilty. But this is Coughlin's final stand, and shortly after this, not only does he lose his radio show, but then when Pearl Harbor is attacked, the U.S. is full-throatedly joining the war effort, and it is no longer cool or interesting to be an isolationist or a fascist in America. And so Coughlin loses a lot of his followers. He's not respectable anymore. The following year, his magazine, Social Justice, goes dark, and this is essentially the end of Coughlin's platform. He no longer has a national reach. He continues to preach at the Shrine of Little Flower, the church he built for the next 23 years. He helped start the school, which is still there. The whole time, the FBI is still, maintaining a file on his activities. But he remains in good enough standing with the church where he retires in 1966 with this big celebration in his honor. It also marked the 50th year of his preaching, so it was a golden jubilee. And he lived out a nice retirement. It was rumored that he died a millionaire because he really loved investments, and he just really liked capitalism. And so that was a rumor, but he died in 1979. He's buried locally at the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Southfield. And it's 13 years after his death when, with the aid of some interfaith groups, the Shrine issues a public apology for Coughlin's anti-Semitism. Who remembers Coughlin today? Well, folks at the Shrine remember him for founding his church that they all use as a worship space, and Christianity to them, is a sacred thing. But outside of the church, the folks who remember him are by and large white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and so this is one example. Edward Reed Fields, who he was a notable segregationist and Klansman, and very ardent anti-Semite. And I stumbled at the University of Michigan Library on this old VHS tape from the 1980s, which is essentially a recruitment video, and this guy is praising Father Coughlin and his rhetorical abilities, and he sort of ends with what's basically a threat, where he says, Father Coughlin still lives, and he's still awakening new people, and a new Father Coughlin will emerge. His word and his work will continue. I can promise you that. There's just some dudes, some Nazi dudes sitting in his living room. But some of that has indeed come to pass. I think there's some hard lines you can draw between the activities of the Christian Front and 80 years later, some of what we see today. And anti-Semitism remains a factor through all of this. One of the members of the U.S. Capitol Police, who even defended the Capitol, was found having a copy of the Protocols of Zion on his person. It's also pretty well known that people who believe in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are more likely to believe in other conspiracy theories. And so there was a study that found that 4 in 5 Americans who believe in the Protocols of Zion also believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory. So a lot of these problems have not gone away. They've found different ways to resurface and to metastasize. So I'm often asked about Shrine today, so I'm going to quickly walk through this. Shrine has, as you can imagine, a pretty complicated relationship with their founder. I sympathize. It's difficult to come to terms with this kind of history, but they do have some of his items on display. And sort of the way that they frame his history is while his pastoral skills produced the splendid Shrine, his political involvement and passionate rhetoric opened him to accusations of anti-Semitism. I first started going to the Shrine in 2017, 2018, trying to establish a relationship with the clergy there. And so the head pastor at the time, his name is Monsignor Robert McClory. He at first told me that Coughlin didn't come up a lot in his day-to-day pastoring. It just wasn't something that Shrine parishioners were necessarily grappling with. But a few months later, fall of 2018, the Tree of Life shooting, Monsignor McClory actually decides that he wants to be a more proactive presence in fighting off anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. And so he goes on the radio to talk about the evils of Father Coughlin. He also just starts participating in a lot of interfaith events in the Detroit area, whereas before Shrine historically had not really done that. And he is eventually designated by Pope Francis as the Archbishop of Gary, Indiana. But before he leaves the Shrine, his very last sermon to his congregation is about anti-Semitism, and specifically about Father Coughlin. And he said, our founding pastor, Father Coughlin, issued words from the airwaves that targeted and hurt many of our Jewish brothers and sisters. His sermon is really interesting, and I find it really moving, because he talks about how we're not trapped by our history, but we are obligated or obliged by it to try to find ways forward and be channels of peace. So that was really very touching to me to see him do that. Today, we're still left with this question of kind of is it safe to be a member of a minority group in America? And there's a feeling that the Jewish Americans know all too well. Memories of Father Coughlin leave a bitter taste in our mouth. Sort of this whole idea, especially here, of sort of being in our own backyard, is really unsettling. So a lot of these questions come back to what we decide to do with our history, and that's something that I'm really trying to explore through the lens of this priest. So as I said, this is all like a prelude to a podcast I'm co-producing with Tablet Studios. The podcast is also called Radioactive. Comes out 2 weeks from today, so you can look for it on iTunes and Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. If you happen to run or know of a local organization that might be interested in sponsoring or working with me and my team on finding ways to tell the story of Father Coughlin, please talk to me. I'd love to work with you. This is my email here. So thank you very much for coming out today, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you. All right, we have some questions. Yeah, go ahead and on the back. Good question. I think I don't have the dictionary in front of me. I mean, it is a pretty I think a pretty established definition by historians at this point. But my understanding of it is that it's sort of using the arm of the state to kind of squash dissent and advocating views that are harmful. And Coughlin, the reason I call him an American fascist is because, as I said, he really admired both fascist leaders such as Mussolini and Franco as well, and also their tactics. And he said that if this is to be a war between communism and fascism, I choose the side of fascism. And this was how a lot of people were framing these issues in the 30s. So there is a lot of there were a lot of fascist sympathizers, and it wasn't even seen as almost a dirty word in the 30s. It was like the political debate of the time. So people were sort of siding one way or the other. But yeah, I'm not necessarily, don't have the definition in front of me, but yeah, go ahead.
Father Coughlin contradicted himself because he was anti-communism, but he was pro-unionist. And if you know to get into unionism, a lot of people calling union people communists.
Yeah.
So I find that really kind of goofy there, how he begins one particular group of people for another when supposedly they were connected.
Yeah.
And so listening to your presentation, I've heard some of Coughlin, but if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, when World War II was going on, a lot of the Catholic big shots, the bishops and the Pope himself, took a lot of the jewelry and valuables that Nazis were taking from the Jews and hiding it over there at the Vatican. So the Vatican still got a lot. It's in the books.
Yeah.
The Vatican still has a lot of Jewish property.
Yeah.
It was taken from them in World War II and will not give it back to anybody who cares. So they were more or less promoting Nazism and anti-Jewism too.
Yeah. Yeah, no, those are great points. I'll repeat the first part for the folks on Zoom. The observation was that Coughlin was pretty ideologically inconsistent. That he backed, he said he was anti-communism, but he was for unions and the worker and that kind of stuff. And that comes up a lot when you look at Coughlin's philosophies. They were very malleable. At the core of it, he believed in himself and he believed in trying to cultivate an audience any way he could. He wasn't exactly being ideologically consistent, as you can see from how quickly he turns on FDR. So yeah, that's a great point. I want to go just over here. Yeah, go ahead. Great question. So the bishop who recruited him to Detroit in 1926, his name was Michael Gallagher, and he was a big supporter of Coughlin. He liked that the priest's showmanship was bringing a lot of people and a lot of attention to the church. And he would have been the one, it's such a hierarchical system that he would have been the one to silence him, and he chose not to. Gallagher died actually right after the 1936 election. So it was a very pivotal moment for Coughlin for a number of reasons. His replacement, Ed Mooney, was largely seen by observers as having been appointed by the Vatican specifically to try to rein in Father Coughlin, because they were starting to get very worried about what he was saying. Maybe not so much the anti-Semitism, but certainly by the negative attention that he was drawing. And so Mooney tried to put in more roadblocks, and he insisted that he review the speeches before Coughlin, read them over the air. But Coughlin kept finding ways to subvert and go around Mooney, and they were in pretty open conflict for most of the time that they were that Mooney was there. But yeah, all those letters between them are fascinating because they're so obviously trying to take each other down.
I heard a long time ago, the Catholic Church put together a history of the Catholic Church in Michigan. And they specifically left Coughlin out of it.
Mm.
And I think this is a Free Press article many years ago, probably in 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And I never knew what the outcome was. I never knew what their response was.
Mm.
I left that whole thing out. And the Free Press said, hey, this is part of the history. But you don't know that.
Yeah, that I don't know that particular story, but yeah, the Detroit Archdiocese, their approach to Coughlin has been really interesting. And really just recently, like 2009, they made public some of the files that I mentioned, the correspondence between Coughlin and Mooney, and I was able to research that. So in recent years, I think there has been more of an effort, and I will also point out the University of Detroit Mercy has a complete digitized archive of Father Coughlin's materials, which is framed explicitly for educational purposes about sort of the same thing that I'm doing, trying to understand, how he operated, so that his kind couldn't repeat again. So yeah, I don't have all the answers about how the Archdiocese thinks about Father Coughlin, but he's certainly part of their history as much as a part of ours. I'm going to actually go. So I saw that someone asked a question on Zoom here. The question is, what was the relationship with Bishop Sheen? I'm not sure I know who Bishop Sheen was. I apologize for that. And then there's a question, what was the added? Oh yeah. Oh, okay, from Detroit? New York. Interesting. Fascinating. I'm learning this for the first time. I don't know what his, I wouldn't know what his relationship with Father Coughlin is, but that's fascinating. Thank you. And then there's a question, what was the attitude of the Shrine's membership regarding Father Coughlin's anti-Semitism? At the time, he was delivering his sermons just as much as he was delivering his radio show. And as I said, he continued to preach for 23 years after he was deplatformed. Although, all accounts are that he wasn't doing as much of the anti-Semitism, and actually gave some interviews towards the end of his life where, he said he never really believed that. So, we can kind of infer about what the Shrine parishioners' views of him were at the time. It seems likely they supported him. I did watch this PBS documentary that was made in, I think, 1989, that interviewed people who had been shrine parishioners when Coughlin was there, and several of them do express anti-Semitic views, and so I don't think it was entirely uncommon. Also worth noting, at the time, that area was just starting to develop, right? The Royal Oak Berkeley corridor, and several, this is not uncommon, but several real estate developers were advertising their new homes as, for the Caucasian race only. And there was, there has been recorded, Klan activity happening around that area at the time. So there's certainly a lot of that going around. I know there were some hands from the audience. Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Listen to your presentation. How close Father Coughlin was. You said he was the first to use the radio to broadcast, his anti-views on situations, and then you have Rush Limbaugh doing the same thing today. Spewing out his anti-Democrat and demi-da-da-da. So I find it kind of unique how Father Coughlin was doing the same thing as Rush Limbaugh used to do. Rush Limbaugh is dead, but I mean,
Right.
Rush Limbaugh used the radio to spew on his anti-whatever you think.
Yeah.
And, have quite a following, as you know, as Father Coughlin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the question was about the links between Father Coughlin and Rush Limbaugh. Coughlin, to the degree that historians have talked about him over the last few decades, another name they gave him is the father of hate radio, and the father of right-wing talk radio, because he really, this was a model he pioneered. You're absolutely right. I mean, he talked for an hour on the radio every week, and people listened to him and loved him. And Coughlin had this built-in advantage, right, that he was also a priest. He was a man of the cloth, and so when you listen to him and you agree with him, you're also, it's like you're hearing God's words. And a lot of his supporters said, there are a lot of letters from people, Christian fronters and otherwise, who believe that God was speaking to them through Father Coughlin. So he had that advantage, which modern sort of fringe media figures don't have. But you can absolutely draw a line, and that's one of the reasons why I think I keep coming back to him, is thinking not only of Rush Limbaugh, but also of InfoWars, and today, like a lot of conspiracy theories that go around on social media. The media universe now is much more stratified than it was in Coughlin's day. You can't reach 40 million people anymore, but you can reach this very segmented portion of people who an algorithm is feeding to you, because it knows they're going to be very susceptible to your views. And so there's a lot of these kind of media fiefdoms that exist now. And strong personalities will always win out at the end of the day. And so that's another thing that Coughlin brought to the table that a lot of modern media figures are still replicating, and it's still working. Are there any other questions? Sure, yeah.
Any connections between Hitler and Coughlin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned, Coughlin was obviously an admirer of Mussolini. His relationship with Hitler is like a little bit blurrier. He always claimed at the end of his life that he had nothing to do with Hitler and never encountered him or met with him. There are, radio shows of his where he goes out of his way to say he doesn't agree with Nazism, that he thinks the Nazis kind of take it a little bit too far. But there are a lot of similarities between what he was publishing in Social Justice magazine and Nazi propaganda that was coming out at the time, to the point where like something coming out by Joseph Goebbels, would find its way almost word for word into Social Justice magazine a few weeks later. And a lot of Coughlin's admirers were Nazi sympathizers, or just members of the Nazi party. And there was a history book that came out in the 90s about Father Coughlin, which I've drawn a bit from, by Don Warren, who was a professor at Oakland University. And he had tried to find more tangible links between Coughlin and Hitler, like signs that they had communicated or anything like that. He wasn't able to quite come up with that, but there were these hints, as I said, that there was some form of communication happening. And there were once Coughlin started to attract the ire of the federal government, and they were passing these new anti-sedition laws in the run-up to the war, the Nazi propaganda system used Father Coughlin as an example of an American who was being silenced, and that this country really wasn't a country of free speech, because a critic of the administration like Father Coughlin didn't have the right to go on his radio show. So they were certainly using him to their advantage, even if he wasn't on their level. Yeah, go ahead. Never. No, but what he did, no, so the question was, did Coughlin admit that he was wrong when evidence of the Holocaust came out? He did not. What he did was just kind of change his story and say, I was never in support of the Nazis and that kind of thing. You know, and there were some Jewish figures, including here in Detroit, who, you know, prior to his most inflammatory radio shows, when he was kind of just a local celebrity, actually would go to bat for him when American Jewish groups would accuse him of coded anti-Semitism. But yeah, the few interviews that he did and the few public appearances that he made from the 40s onward, he was always careful to, you know, speak highly of the Jewish people. I have a question on the Zoom. I'm going to see what it says. Since the Vatican did not come out strongly against Father Coughlin, could this be attributed to any anti-Semitism attitudes in the Vatican? Yeah, similar to what the gentleman was saying. There was certainly you know, a good deal of anti-Semitism in the Vatican at the time. Historians are still sort of digging into the Vatican's reaction to World War II and the Holocaust, and you know, that is a bit outside of my scope. There have been several great magazine articles, even just recently, sort of digging into that question. You know, my sort of elementary view of it is that there was sort of largely a hands-off approach that was happening. The Pope didn't want to get too involved, but you know, it wasn't so much similar to the FBI, which also had a lot of anti-Semites, especially in the early years of its forming under J. Edgar Hoover. It wasn't so much that Coughlin was anti-Semitic that they didn't like. They didn't like his approach and his loud mouth and his need to attract attention to himself, which in the Vatican's case was very anti, you know, what their mission of the church was. And you know, the FBI was concerned that he was, you know, trying to overthrow the U.S. government. So in both these cases, how much of it was the anti-Semitism and how much was it that he was just making the church look bad? You know, who's to say? But I think that's partially why he got away with it for so long. Yeah, go ahead.
Was it you found his speech, or was it the pressure not to be broadcast?
I'm so glad you asked that. About the question was about the communications between Bishop Mooney and Father Coughlin. I had access to those files, and I spent a long time looking through them. As I said, they were only recently made public, so it was pretty exciting to be there at the archives of the Archdiocese of Detroit. I'm looking through them, and their historians were also, by the way, very excited that I was there, very supportive of the project. They thought it needed to be talked about. These are just the historians who work there, but it was a fascinating correspondence, because you see at the beginning of his tenure, Mooney is saying, well, you know, the media is saying a lot of things, but we won't let that get in the way of our professional relationship, and as long as we respect each other, we'll be fine. And then you see that relationship deteriorate noticeably over the next couple of years. Coughlin is sending him, you know, has to send him the speeches before he goes on the air, and he claims he's being censored, and he's going around behind Mooney's back and talking out of turn about him. And in the meantime, their letters still have this sort of baseline cordiality, and Mooney is saying, maybe you shouldn't say that, and Coughlin saying, well, I would really like to say that, and then he goes around and publishes something in Social Justice that's horrible and inflammatory, and then he'll say, hey, Bishop Mooney, would you like to sign this letter in support of the Christian Front? And Mooney says, no, I don't think you should be doing that. And eventually what it comes down to is Mooney presents Coughlin with an ultimatum. This is how they finally get him off the air, right? And he says, you can either keep your radio show and your newspaper and voluntarily leave the priesthood so that we don't have to deal with you anymore, or you can remain a priest and give up your platform, because this isn't what you're supposed to be doing. Coughlin chooses the priesthood, probably because he knows it'll keep him employed for, you know, the next few decades. But that's sort of the end of it, and it is finally Mooney who's able to assert himself over Coughlin. But it's a really fascinating bunch of correspondence, and of course, people are also sending Mooney letters from all over the country, right? People who are pro-Coughlin, people who are anti-Coughlin, people who wanted some kind of action taken against Coughlin. Once the word got out that Mooney was, you know, where the buck stopped, he was flooded with a lot of these correspondence. And so it's really like there's so much drama and you know, dispute happening in those letters. Yes, go ahead.
Was Father Coughlin not also a racist?
Most certainly, yes. He does not, he doesn't really talk a lot about race in the period, at least where his recordings survived. I should say that the vast majority of the surviving recordings of Father Coughlin's radio show that we have come from the late 1930s, so it's towards the end of his career. So it's possible he was talking about race beforehand. It was certainly not a big part of his image. Again, a lot of his followers were very racist, and that's been pretty openly documented. And also, as I said, the community that he was serving was by design pretty much an exclusively white community that was, actively kind of driving out people of color. I will say this is an aside that didn't make the presentation, but it will be in the podcast. Coughlin had this famous story that he would tell when he was getting the shrine off the ground. He claimed, oh, the Ku Klux Klan, because they're anti-Catholic, showed up at the lawn where we were building the shrine and planted a burning cross. And I stood there and I shook my fist and I was astonished and outraged that the cross, would be perverted for hatred. And so I vowed to build a cross that the Klan would never be able to burn, which is how you got the design of the current shrine. But so you see there that Coughlin knew how to use this, infamous racist presence of the Klan almost to his advantage to create a sense of victimhood and persecution. But there's not any actual evidence that this happened. The local papers never wrote about any cross burnings happening on that spot, and local historians I talked to said they doubted that it actually happened. But the legend persists, and there actually is a plaque at the shrine commemorating the supposed cross burning. So, or the Coughlin's, supposed standing up to the supposed cross burning. We have one more question on the Zoom. This is more information about Father Sheen. Okay, in 1936, a Boston reporter asked Sheen for his opinion of Father Coughlin, who, like Sheen, was a popular radio priest. Coughlin had begun to express support for fascist governments and purvey anti-Semitic conspiracies as causes of war and economic depression. Sheen, careful not to speak too ill of a brother priest, said that Coughlin chooses to confine himself largely to the material, whereas Sheen's sermons were confined to spiritual values that outlast the material. So when Coughlin started the National Union for Social Justice, Sheen called American Catholics to a holy hour of adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. And that's where he died in 1979, which is also the year that Coughlin died. The reference to the Boston reporter may well have been Frances Sweeney, who was a very well-known anti-hate sort of crusading journalist in Boston at the time. And she, although she died very young, she was vociferously anti-Coughlin and did a lot of reporting on the Christian front, a lot of really good investigative journalism, sort of uprooting a lot of these sources of hatred in her own community, and she was roundly, taken to task for it by the local church presence and also the local government. The Boston mayor at the time, made a point of saying that they were the most pro-Coughlin city in the country, and so she was, today we'd probably say she was like a member of the resistance movement, but certainly what she was doing was very brave. And so that's another little tidbit about sort of the ripple effects of Coughlin's antics on the country. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been really wonderful to get to talk to you, and thank you for being here. And please be safe.